Please pray with me. Gracious God, may the meditations of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be a pleasing offering to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. In the summer of 2001, which is kind of crazy to think about, is that like almost, 22 plus years ago, I was a global ministries missionary. It was a short stint teaching English in Lithuania, which is in Eastern Europe. It's one of the Baltics. And our group was a very eclectic one. And, on the one hand, we had some pretty conservative evangelicals in our group, and we had more liberal ones, and we had everything in between. And I generally hang out with the younger teachers that were about my age. And we happened to start talking about the question that maybe some of you have been asked, but it's often asked by evangelicals of those of us who are non-evangelical, the question being, are you born again? Are you born again? And maybe some of you have had that question asked you. Now, I've never really known how to answer that question, because for evangelicals, they believe you have this moment in your life when you become saved, when you're born again. But what about those of us who were raised in the church, who've never known a time when we didn't have faith in Jesus Christ? So I've never really known exactly how to answer that. But one of my fellow teachers, she had a story to tell about it. Her uncle, whenever he was asked that question, he would say, well, just now, it happened again. There it is, again, again. His point was that in each and every moment, when we choose to follow Jesus, we've essentially been born again. It's not a single moment. It's something that happens in our lives over and over again. Each moment is a potential place where we can be born again. And I found that very helpful. During the season of Lent, our Hebrew Bible texts all include stories about covenants. And our reading for today from Genesis refers to the covenant that God makes after the flood. It is a promise to not destroy the world. God puts down God's weapon of war, God's bow, and places it in the clouds as a sign to us and as a reminder to God. God makes the promise speaking to Noah, but this covenant is ultimately with all humanity and all living creatures on the earth. And I think this is a key passage in the Hebrew Bible, because God in this moment commits to working with the world as it is. God recognizes our human sinfulness and yet chooses to find another way forward, a path of redemption, which continues then throughout the whole Bible. It is a reminder to us that no matter what, God's redeeming love will triumph. No matter what, God will not destroy. God will instead seek a way forward to redeem and to save. And we can always rely on God's love. Now, our epistle reading comes from 1 Peter, which some of you might be surprised by, because you're like, wow, is there actually something in the lectionary that didn't come from Paul in the epistles? He did write a good chunk of the New Testament, but yes, today it's 1 Peter. Here, the writer emphasizes that Christ's suffering was to bring us to God. He was killed, but then he was raised by God. And now he is seated at the right hand of God. Actually, I'm left-handed. I'll just say left hand of God. In authority. And note that the author makes an explicit connection to the flood of Noah. God saved them through water, and now God saves us through the water of baptism. Reminder to what God has done in Jesus Christ for us all. The great sacrifice that God has made on our behalf. Now, one thing you should know about the Gospel of Mark. The writer of Mark does not provide any extraneous detail. Short and to the point is the norm with Mark. And you can see that in today's reading, where in 3 short paragraphs, Mark covers Jesus' baptism, his temptation for 40 days in the wilderness, and the beginning of his ministry. All of that is covered in this morning's reading, which is a handful of verses. That's Mark for you, short and to the point. Jesus' baptism then led him into the wilderness. Here we can see that Jesus' ministry is being presented as a second Exodus. Because just as the nation of Israel was born in water with the parting of the Red Sea and wandered and was tested in the wilderness for 40 years, Jesus' baptism then led him into the wilderness for 40 days. So Jesus is directly connected with the Israel story. It is like a second Exodus. Jesus sets an example. He goes through baptism and then he experiences real trials and tribulations, and yet he emerges triumphant. This reminds us the life of faith, it isn't easy. It's one of trials and tribulations. So we can look to Jesus as our model, someone we can imitate and draw inspiration from. Now, today is a special day, not just because it's the first Sunday in Lent, but because we have 2 people who are reaffirming their baptism today and joining our community. When an individual does that before us, we all together are reaffirming our baptism. Lent is a time of preparation for Good Friday and for Easter. And these 40 days are a time for us to reflect. So it's very appropriate to have these 2 join us at the beginning of Lent. That sets the tone for the whole season. We remember the vows made at our baptism, and we have the opportunity to be born again. And yet again, we choose for the ways of Christ against evil forces that try to oppress and destroy. Lent is a time to reflect on what our calling is and how we fall short of that. Now, one of my professors at Eden liked to tell the story of one of his elderly parishioners who was in a nursing home at the time. He was pastoring a formerly ENR church, much like Bethany. In fact, it was probably Reformed, just like Bethany. He had a member he'd visit in the nursing home. And they had an evangelical pastor who would, he would do his rounds. He'd come around and he'd always try to convert her. And she didn't, for whatever reason, appreciate that very much. So when he asked her if she was born again, she asked him if he knew his catechism. And that shut him up. Lent is a time of reflection. It is a time of remembrance. It is a time of renewal. We are called to be born again. We choose again the ways of life over the ways of death. We remember our baptism. We remember God's saving love, and we remember Jesus' sacrifice. That's what Lent is supposed to be about. And I really wish I had planned to have 2 people join the church on the first Sunday of Lent. It just happened to work out that way. which is very advantageous because we all get to start Lent remembering, oh, that's right, those are the vows that are made at baptism. Those are the promises that are made. Oh, yeah. So we have 40 days to think about it. 40 days to renew ourselves. 40 days to think about what God has done for us. And then we will celebrate Easter together.